Friday the 13th, Carnival of Maniacs, Chapter 7. The drums beat with a fervor that was turning the air into heat. Every note they played was urgent, every pattern they spun so complex as to banish all thought in favor of delirium. An uninformed listener would have dismissed the tropical rhythms as mere noise, a furious cacophony of random sounds, while someone with more Catholic taste would have held the performance as a virtuoso display in percussive world music. But to Special Agent Kyler, the breakneck interplay of the three handcrafted drums, the heavy man-man timbale, the medium-sized sagan, and the small, high-pitched bula, meant only one thing: death. She reached inside the jacket of her stylish mocha pantsuit and took the Glock 22 out of its shoulder holster. When she'd first joined the Bureau, the guys had recommended the Glock 23. They told her it was lighter and smaller than the 22, making it easier to conceal. But what they'd really meant to say was that a model with 4% less kick was more suitable for a woman, just like the small of the back holster they'd offered her, because a normal side holster would probably ride up her hips. In response, Michelle Kyler had given her advisors a lesson of her own. "Guns are for shooting, not hiding," she'd said, adding, "And, for your information, studies have shown that women can draw faster from a shoulder holster than men. The female rib cage has a natural slope better suited to shoulder holster design, and women have greater physical flexibility. But if you guys want to go on wearing cupless bras because you think they look macho, don't let little old me stop you." Then she proceeded to shoot perfect score after perfect score, both on the range and on Hogan's Alley, the realistic training environment at the FBI Academy in Quantico. And that same deadly accuracy had served her time and again throughout her 8 years working law enforcement. Kyler didn't have a name for her semi-automatic, but whenever she felt its stifled grip in the palm of her hand, it was like being in the presence of an old friend. The only difference being that the Glock 22 never let her down. She stopped and listened to where the music was coming from. The condemned tenement block was vast, and any mistake now could be critical. But the bare walls gave off echoes that made exact determination difficult. Worse, the drums had just altered their tempo, in a way that old Kyler, she was running out of time. Because just as the great fictional detective Sherlock Holmes was supposedly an expert in recognizing different varieties of tobacco ash, Michelle Kyler was a very real authority on the sinister music that was pounding in anticipation of the imminent sunrise. Indeed, she was so accomplished in her studies that she understood the patterns racing off the goatskin drumheads just as clearly as if they were in Morse code. The rhythms spoke to her of their origin in animistic religious ceremonies practiced in 13th century Africa. They invoked images of traveling some 300 years later in French and Spanish slave ships to an island which Christopher Columbus named La Isla Espanola, an island abundant with natural riches, but where manpower was in short supply, after the native population of 2 million Taino-Arawak people had been all but wiped out under 15 years of brutal European rule. The drums also suggested the bloody revolution of 1791, when the priest Bokmenduti set his African kinsmen on a violent path that culminated in a Declaration of Independence in 1804. The victorious slaves calling their new nation by the island's original Taino-Arawak name of Haiti. And now in the year 2005, those same rhythms, those same primal drums were charging the night with mystery. Still distant, still veiled in darkness, and spurring men on to deeds of fanatical devotion. Still invoking the menace of the most feared and misunderstood religion in the world. For when the three Rada drums spoke aloud, in this derelict building on the northern outskirts of Buffalo, New York, Michelle Kyler heard the unmistakable voice of Vodal. She tiptoed across the lobby to an old fire door. The door was falling off its hinges, but the slim brunette managed to squeeze through and, without making a sound, came out at the bottom of a concrete stairwell which, like the rest of the block, was decorated with graffiti, stale urine, and trash. Kyler glanced at her watch. The music was already telling her that dawn was less than 10 minutes away, but she had to be sure. 5:46. The victim had approximately 7 minutes to live. The federal agent wished she was wrong, but the rhythms were specific. They were designed to summon the Iwa, the spirit of Baron Samedi, chief of all the dead. At 5:53 precisely, the sun would break the horizon, the drumming would reach its climax, and the third abductee in 4 months would be killed in a ritual homicide. Suddenly, no longer caring whether her shoes made any noise, Kyler sprang up the steps 2 at a time. It wasn't possible for the kidnappers to hear her over the drums, so all she had to worry about was whether or not they'd posted a lookout. But by the time she reached the 5th floor, where the music was loudest, Kyler had seen no sign of anyone, which meant the killers were confident they wouldn't be discovered. Gun at the ready, Kyler eased open the first door onto the main hallway, through the level, and was so deafened by the sharp increase in volume that she wanted to cover her ears. The drums were impossibly loud. Dust fell from the ceiling as the plaster vibrated with staccato insistence. The music was frenetic, overpowering, calling down the Iwa of Baron Samedi, whose symbol was the cross and whose natural domain was the graveyard. Again Kyler paused, only this time it was to regulate her breathing. Firearms 101. Unless you can manage the physiological effects of stress in a survival situation, your complex motor skills deteriorate, your depth perception and peripheral vision are seriously reduced, and you may even experience hypervigilance, a stress response that will cause you either to freeze or to behave irrationally, as in a state of panic. Any one of these problems can turn a marksman on the range into a corpse on the streets. A few seconds later, Kyler was perfectly calm. She flexed the fingers of her right hand round the grip of the Glock and raised her left hand so that she could check the time. 5:47. 6 minutes left. The musty corridor ran the entire length of the building, completely dark save for a few rectangles of pale gray where apartments were left open to admit the first feeble scrapings of dawn through broken windows. Kyler had left her flashlight in the trunk of her car, but the drums were leading her to the second door on the right, as effectively as a neon arrow. And if that wasn't enough of a lead, the kidnappers had chalked a large death head on the door, just like they had at the scene of the previous Valdo homicides. There had been 2 murders in the series so far: computer technician Victor Carullo in February and personal trainer Saul Galassi in March. Both men had been kidnapped early in the evening, both taken to abandoned properties on the edge of town, Carullo to the north and Galassi to the east, and both killed at sunrise on the morning following their abduction. Officially, the deaths were outside Kyler's jurisdiction. They had happened over in Buffalo, which had its own field office, while Kyler was based in a resident agency in Corning, New York, a small satellite branch that reported into Albany. But then Kyler never paid any attention to territorial boundaries during her regular trawls through the National Crime Information Center database. For as long as Kyler had been with the Bureau, she'd spent 1 night a week alone in front of a computer terminal, searching through hundreds of new cases added daily to the NCIC, banking on the rare instance that one of them might demonstrate the features she was looking for. Coming from a small town in the South and being a federal agent in a big city was overwhelming, but she had found her place easily. It was on one such evening that she'd recently discovered the files on the unsolved Carullo and Galassi homicides. A consultant ethnologist had given his firm opinion that both men had been murdered as part of a Valdau sacrificial rite. Crime scene photos showed both bodies lying gagged and bound in the exact center of a veve, a large symbolic drawing traced on the ground in cornmeal. According to Valdau mythology, each Iwa had its own veve, the symbol acting as the spirit's signature and used in rituals to attract the spirit to the earthly plane. In the case of the Buffalo murders, the veve used was that of Baron Samedi. Autopsy reports stated that both victims had been sedated with the plant-based narcotic of unknown origin. Both had been killed by a knife blow to the heart, and both had undergone post-mortem dismemberment, during which the heart, lungs, liver, and brain were all removed and taken from the crime scene. The whereabouts of these missing organs remained unknown. Furthermore, both bodies had been partially eaten. Saliva, DNA, and bite mark tests had proved conclusively that those responsible for the injuries were human. Other trace evidence suggested there were 3 or 4 abductors, all Caucasian, working as a team. Alone, none of these facts would have caught Kyler's attention. The history of crime was replete, with homicides of a similarly occult nature. However, she was surprised to see no mention in the file of two other obvious features. Fact 1. Both murders were carried out on the first night of the full moon in the respective months. Fact 2. The killers were using the homicides to draw a giant cross, the symbol of Baron Samedi, over the city of Buffalo. Carullo was killed to the north, Galassi to the east, and in April the killers had failed to kill Bob Reed to the south. Like the two men before him, Reed had been kidnapped and taken to a deserted warehouse, but somehow he'd managed to break free. In the ensuing struggle, Reed was stabbed 3 times, but survived just long enough to dial 911. His call had been recorded. "Gotta help, please. I'm bleeding. They got me. Voodoo. Tried to kill me. Dead people. Zombies. They're alive." A police dispatch found Reed's body lying outside a call booth, while an extensive search of the neighborhood uncovered the place of the intended sacrifice. But it was on reading a transcript of the man's dying words that Kyler had decided to get involved. By rights, she should have gone to her boss Landau and offered Buffalo advice through the normal channels. But the killers were operating a monthly program, so Kyler simply didn't have time to follow correct procedure. She tracked the gang down solely by relying on hunches and her knowledge of Vadu, a line of investigation that any decent defense attorney would have turned into a charge of harassment. Also, there was another reason, more important than her selfless burning of the rulebook, why Kyler had gone solo. Reed had mentioned zombies, the living dead. If such beings truly existed, Special Agent Kyler needed to see them, needed to know. The only guaranteed way of doing that was to make sure she was present at their next scheduled appearance. So here she was, risking her career, her future, and even her life, drawn by the lure of voodoo drums. Procedure demanded that she immediately withdraw and request backup, but Kyler wasn't listening. She crept forwards. 1 step, 2 steps. The music grew even louder. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed deeply, counting to herself in 4-second loops. Her watch read 5:51. Lifting the gun in both hands, she got ready to kick open the door. She decided to adopt the isosceles shooting stance. Arms forward, head low, legs apart, shoulders hunched, chest turned to face the target. Inside, the drums were locking astral thunder with the Iowa of Baron Cemetery, the Cemetery Baron, Baron Samedi. "Vadu," they hammered. "Vadu!" Suddenly, Kyler heard a faint moan, muffled, gagged, the cries of their latest victim. Her LED flipped to 5:52, less than 60 seconds before the knife stabbed into a pumping, beating heart. She breathed once, twice, tightened her hold on the Glock, then spun away from the wall and kicked the door wide open. "Federal agent!" Kyler had less than a second to make sense of the unreal tableau arrayed before her. The door opened into a small living room. A naked man lay on the floor. He'd already suffered a number of superficial cuts, and his blood was mingling with the yellowish cornmeal on the veve to form a sickly paste. He was bound at the wrists and ankles, and a squat wooden phallus had been plugged into his mouth. As soon as he saw Kyler, the man tried to call out, but his screams were muffled, leaving only the aching, arcing of his torso to convey the horror of his predicament. Outside the veve, the floorboards were peppered with short black candles, the waxen stubs releasing a peculiar odor that reminded Kyler of incense, while standing in the corners were 4 electronic speakers, whose ceremonial function was to blast a surround sound recording of Vadu drums into the center of the room. Kyler noticed 2 doors in the wall facing her. One led to the bathroom and the other opened into a kitchen area. Both doors were ajar and someone could easily have been hiding on the other side of them. But of more immediate concern to the federal agent was the maniac dancing over the kidnapped victim, terrorizing him with near-miss slashes of an ornamental dagger. The killer writhed and chanted in time with the music, seemingly oblivious to Kyler's warning, and he was attired exactly as she knew he would be. Black tuxedo, black pants, top hat. His face was daubed with white paint to give his already pale skin an even more corpse-like appearance, and his eyes were concealed behind sunglasses. To all intents and purposes, this man, with his sadistic blade painting, was a living embodiment of Baron Samedi. Special Agent Kyler, however, knew him by another name. "Carlton Wallace!" she shouted, struggling to be heard above the tribal cacophony. "I'm placing you under arrest." And it was at that point that the zombies shuffled into the room. 2 came from the kitchen and 1 from the bathroom. 3 men dressed in rags, their skin unnaturally bleached and their eggshell eyes devoid of any color. Drool spilled from their sagging mouths as they shambled forwards, their shocking appearance distracting the agent, who had been awake all night, and who was gradually succumbing to the soporific effects of the drugged candles. Baron Samedi spun on the balls of one foot and howled with laughter as he prepared to flick the dagger into Kyler's face. Kyler made a tactical assessment. 4 opponents, all less than 3 yards away. She was in the wrong stance and should have had the gun in one hand instead of 2. All the same, the Baron posed the most critical threat, and there was plenty of time to fire a bullet straight between his eyes. Michelle squeezed the trigger, and the .40 caliber round exploded through the left lens of Wallace's shades and drilled a hole through to the back of his skull. The Baron was dead even before he started to fall, and when his body hit the deck, it extinguished exactly 13 candles. Kyler was furious with herself for putting the shot an inch to the left of where she'd aimed it. Her poor choice of stance was about to backfire as the zombies suddenly screeched into life and came diving for her. She tried to bring the gun around, but one of the zombies grabbed hold of her forearm and pushed it up into the air, causing both arms to snap vertical and her second bullet to hit the ceiling. And while the shot was going wide, a second zombie punched Kyler in the gut, and the third landed a crushing sidekick just below her right knee. The agent cried out in pain and dropped the Glock to the floor, just as the third zombie hit her with another kick square across the chest. The blow sent Kyler stumbling through the open door and back out into the hallway, where she slammed against the far wall before falling down on her ass. She shook her head and tried to regain some focus. Her gun was back inside the apartment, resting on the floor. She could see the kidnapped victim struggling against his restraints and Baron Samedi lying dead with a bullet in his brain. But the 3 zombies were coming out to finish her, so if Kyler was ever going to find out whether or not the creatures were real, now was the time. Pretending to be more stunned than she really was, Kyler snuck a hand inside her jacket pocket and braced herself as the 3 undead assailants fell upon her. Their hands grabbed at her clothes, ripping, pulling, and scratching. She tried to shield herself, but the 30 shredding fingernails were coming in too fast. The drums built to a crescendo at the third zombie. The one who kicked her into the corridor bent down, grabbed her shoulders, and pinned them back against the wall. Then he leaned forward, his lips parted and his jaws opened wide, bearing 2 rows of perfect teeth. "Now!" shouted Kyler, pulling a handful of salt out of her pocket and ramming it into the zombie's dripping maw. The tiny crystals were hardly standard issue, but the traditional way to defeat a zombie, according to Haitian folklore, was to put salt in its mouth. This was the acid test. The other 2 creatures stood back, trying to make sense of what Kyler was doing. But the zombie with the white powdered tongue coughed, choked, spat, and then laughed. "You stupid fucking bitch," he sneered, chewing on the salt, very much a human being and very much alive. Then he screamed at Kyler, and all she could see was his open mouth, hurtling towards her face. As she came to, the first thing Glow noticed was a sharp pain in her ribs. She didn't know if it was bruising or just early morning stiffness, but it was all she could think of as she yawned, rubbed her eyes, and climbed sluggishly to her feet. She'd been sleeping on the forest floor all night. Her clothes were damp, and now, in the early morning light, she could see just how dirty they were. But how did they get that way? Glow knew she'd come to Crystal Lake with her friends, but after that everything was hazy. "Trick!" she shouted, her voice shrill against the chirruping of the dawn chorus. "Zima!" She tried again, but there was no reply. The girl massaged her aching chest and looked down to where she'd been sleeping. She expected to see a big rock lying there, but what she found was the head of Pamela Voorhees. Suddenly her mind's eye was sent hurtling through a vortex of 2020 memory. She remembered everything. The trucker, the voice in her head, the cabin with that horrible shrine, the death of her 2 friends, and Jason. Jason Voorhees was alive. He'd killed Trick, and he killed Zemal. The bodies were over in the other side of the woods. Glow ran out onto the road and found herself standing in the middle of a spaghetti of skid marks. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. "The Winnebago," she gasped, clutching her hair. "It hit me and Jason, and the morons, oh God, they took Jason!" Panic began to infect her voice as she flitted back and forth across the asphalt, trying to pluck key words from the fog of her previous night's concussion. "There was a woman and a man, an old man. That's it! They were arguing about something. Now what was it? What were they saying?" She knew the answer was buried somewhere in her mind, and she could feel it getting closer. If only she could make the final synaptic connection. "A carnival!" she shouted, shaking her head. "A freaking sideshow! The idiots! They're all dead!" Glow looked up and down the road, but there wasn't a vehicle in sight, so she took out her cell phone, her mind flooded by sudden memories of Trick dying, choking on his own receiver, and pressed the on switch. She hadn't used the cell phone since leaving Seattle, so the power had to be good. But would she still have a signal? Yes! Her first thought was to speed dial the local sheriff's office, but then she remembered how well that had gone last night, and thumped 911. Her call was answered right away. "They can't help you, dear," said Pamela Voorhees through the earpiece. "No one can. You're too late." Glow screamed in shock and threw the phone to the ground. Almost immediately, she made a move to pick it up again, but the cell was broken. She turned and glared in the direction of the severed head. "This is all your fault, you old bitch!" she snarled and ran back to where the head was lying, fully intending to stomp on Pamela until there was nothing left of her. But when Glow raised her trail boot, she caught sight of the shriveled eye sockets and was transfixed. Her foot hovered in midair as the cadaverous gaze held her against her will. Back on the road, Pamela's laughter rang out of the shattered cell phone. The kidnapped victim wriggled across the bare floor and kicked his bound feet in unison, brushing the Glock 22 and sending it sliding out into the corridor. Kyler was now lying on her back. One of the zombies was gripping her left calf and trying to bite it. Another was clumsily sprawled across her body, his generous catsuit of fat helping to keep her off balance. And the third was still recovering from having 4 teeth broken by her headbutt. The salt in his wounds just had to hurt. But as soon as the gun skidded within reach, Kyler took hold of it, put it against the temple of the obese phony, and decorated the hallway with his rose drops. At the sound of the shot, the zombie who'd been struggling to get his teeth through her polyester cotton pants pulled away and tried to stand up. In doing so, he conveniently lined up for bullets 4 and 5 straight through the heart. At this point, Kyler should have advised the remaining zombie, the salty kickboxer, of his Miranda right to remain silent. After all, he was no longer posing a threat, just holding his mouth and whining. He wept even more when bullet number 6 entered his right kneecap, and shut the fuck up when bullet number 7 hit him between the eyes. 4 perfect shots from a reclining position, with Kyler straining to lift her head and shoulders off the ground while trapped beneath a dead well. That took skill. She crawled out from under the quivering corpse and checked herself for injury. There were scratches, bruises, some bite indentation, but nothing serious. The kidnapped victim called to her through the phallus and raised his limbs to suggest she might want to untie him. Exhaling with the sudden decrease in stress, Kyler walked back into the ceremonial apartment. "And you can shut up." She fired shot number 8 into the CD player, and at last the voodoo drums were halted. The abrupt silence had an eerie effect. Somehow the bodies of the Baron and his 3 lackeys suddenly seemed more real. Again the kidnapped victim wordlessly urged her assistance. Kyler smiled in apology, and returning the Glock to its holster, bent down to untie his wrists. Suddenly the apartment exploded with heavy footfalls, and Kyler found herself staring into the squat barrels of 4 Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns. "Put your hands in the air!" barked a voice. Kyler looked back at the victim and shrugged. They'd just been rescued by a SWAT team. It was shaping up to be a beautiful morning. The skies were blue, the temperature was perfect, warm with a cooling breeze, and the clean woodland air made for an invigorating tonic. Glow sang as she marched along the side of the road, hands holding the straps of her backpack, her jaunty Girl Scout demeanor at odds with her goth styling. She'd been trying to hitch a ride for the last couple of hours, but so far there'd been no takers. One bastion of the local community had even gone to the trouble of winding down his window and calling her a fucking weirdo as he'd driven by. There was another car coming right now. Glow could hear its engine rise gently behind her. Almost out of desperation, the girl extended the thumb. She wasn't optimistic, but there was somewhere she badly needed to be, and time was running out. The metallic Cerise Lexus pulled up a few yards ahead of her. Hardly believing her luck, Glow ran to the passenger door just as the driver leaned across and pushed it open. "Where are you headed?" he asked. The driver was a smoothly handsome man in his late 20s. Judging from his white Dior shirt, Italian-cut pants, and excessive hair gel, Glow presumed he was traveling on business, an executive of some kind. "Hunt Ridge," she answered, placing one hand on the door and one hand on the chassis to dissuade the man from pulling away. "That is, if it's not too inconvenient." "Well, I can take you halfway," he offered. "If I drop you at Reculver, Reculver will be just fine and dandy," Glow interrupted, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. But then she noticed the driver was frowning. "Is something wrong, dear?" she asked. The driver eased back in his seat and grinned apologetically. "No, it's just, I just don't do mornings." How could he explain to the girl that the way she talked just didn't fit the way she looked? When he'd thrown open the door to the kid in the biker jacket and the black baggy pants, he'd expected to find her cool or full of snap. He certainly didn't expect her to act like his mother. And why was there blood on her mouth? "Oh, I quite understand," answered Glow, lifting the backpack off her shoulders. "My son's the same. It's all I can do to get him started every day." The driver tried not to show it, but Glow's reply knocked him sideways. Her son? She looked like she was 15 or 16 herself. Quickly, he tried to get off the subject. He nodded at her pack. "You want to put that in the trunk?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Glow snatched the bag close to her chest, and a palsy of hatred spewed her face. But when she saw how oddly the driver was looking at her, she forced her mouth into a smile. No, thank you," she said, relaxing her grip on the backpack. "If it's all the same to you, I'll just keep it on my lap." "Suit yourself," replied the man wearily. Glow paused, half expecting him to change his mind about the ride. Instead, he held out his hand. "The name's Elliot," he said. The girl smiled and shook his hand. "Pleased to meet you, Elliot." Then she took her place in the passenger seat and reached for the seatbelt. "My name's Pamela." Elliot watched as she finished buckling up. "Play basketball, Pam?" At first, the possessed teenager didn't know what he was talking about. But then she saw him staring at the large, spherical shape bulging through her backpack, and she began to laugh. "Something like that, dear," she chuckled, patting the severed head. "A healthy body makes a healthy mind, I always say." With that, she closed the door, and very shortly the two ill-matched traveling companions were putting Crystal Lake well behind them. Okay, this has been Chapter 7. I'm going to have to stop here tonight. Sorry, guys, I've been gone for a few days. I had severe strep throat, was running 103-degree temperature. I was pretty sick. My throat was about swollen shut. So I'm sorry that I haven't had an upload in a few days, but I am back now. Things are looking better. I'm feeling better. Hope you enjoyed tonight's chapter. I got to say it first, when I first started this chapter, I was like, am I reading the right book? But then we got to Glow and everything with Pamela and all that, and I think we're back on track now. Let me know in the comment section what you guys thought of tonight's chapter, and I'll be back very soon with more of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. Till next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, and even the 80s slasher librarian gets sick sometimes. Sorry, guys. See you next time. Have a good night.